The winds that swept through Blackthorn Village carried whispers of things best left unsaid. Shrouded in perpetual mist, the tiny hamlet nestled between the moors and the dark, ancient woods was a place where superstitions festered like open wounds. Crooked lanes led to weather-worn cottages, their sagging roofs seemingly bowing under the weight of tales passed down through generations of witches, beasts, and other unnatural horrors. But in the autumn of 1847, a new shadow crept over Blackthorn. It was not a wraith from folklore, but something far closer. A terror with flesh, blood, and a heartbeat. Dr. Elias Grey had arrived in Blackthorn 2 years prior, a man of impeccable demeanor and mysterious origins. He established a modest clinic on the village's edge, where the untamed woods clawed at civilization's boundary. His arrival had been hailed as a blessing by the townsfolk. The previous doctor, an elderly man of frail constitution, had succumbed to a wasting illness, leaving the village to its own devices for months. Dr. Grey was a man of contrasts, his appearance immaculate, his voice calm and reassuring. Yet, his eyes held an odd luminescence, a pale silver sheen that unsettled those who looked too long. But no one questioned his skill. A healer who saved lives was far too valuable to interrogate with idle suspicions. For 2 years, his practice flourished. Children were born under his care, fevers abated at his touch, and even wounds thought fatal were mended by his hands. Yet, as the seasons turned, a darker pattern emerged. It began with whispers. Old Mr. Cleary, who had gone to see the doctor for a persistent cough, vanished one crisp October night. His wife swore he had left for the clinic and never returned. Then there was young Lucy Harrow, who limped into Dr. Grey's practice with an infected wound and was never seen again. The disappearances were sporadic, yet each one seemed to coincide with the full moon. At first, the villagers clung to mundane explanations. Perhaps the patients had left town, overcome by wanderlust or shameful secrets. But when the butcher's mastiff, a beast of unmatched ferocity, was found torn to pieces in the woods under the light of a swollen moon, the whispers grew louder. Some claimed a wild animal was to blame, a wolf or perhaps a bear driven from the northern forests. Others muttered about curses, ancient and unbroken, tied to the land. But no one dared voice the most chilling possibility aloud, that the monster wore a human face by day. And so, as the full moon rose once more over Blackthorn, casting its cold, pale light on cobblestone streets, the village trembled. Behind locked doors, candles flickered and prayers were whispered. But in the shadows, unseen by all, a predator stirred. The air in the clinic was heavy with the scent of carbolic soap and linseed oil. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting fragile patterns on the polished wooden floors. Dr. Grey worked methodically, his slender fingers deftly stitching a jagged wound on the forearm of a farmer who had been careless with his scythe. "You're fortunate, Doctor," Grey said, his voice a low murmur as he tied the final knot. Another inch deeper, and this might have severed the tendon entirely. The farmer, a burly man with ruddy cheeks, winced but managed a grateful nod. "Thank ye, Doctor. Wouldn't know what to do without you." Dr. Grey offered a faint smile, his eyes briefly meeting the farmer's before returning to his work. "Take care to keep the wound clean. Return in 3 days so I can inspect it." As the farmer rose to leave, Margaret Henshaw entered the room carrying a tray of clean bandages. The young nurse had been in Dr. Grey's employ since his arrival, and though she admired his skill, she found him an enigma. He rarely spoke of his past, and his detached demeanor made him difficult to know. "Another full clinic today," she remarked, setting the tray on a side table. "It seems every week there's more work to be done." Dr. Grey glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Illness and injury are constant companions in a place like this. Blackthorn is fortunate to have someone willing to address them. Margaret hesitated. Do you ever feel overwhelmed, Doctor, by the weight of it all? Dr. Grey paused, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. A doctor must learn to carry such burdens without faltering, Miss Henshaw. It is the nature of our work. His words were reassuring, but something about the way he said them made Margaret's skin prickle. There was a distance in his tone, as though the burdens he carried were far heavier than any he could name. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. It was nearing dusk, and already the light was beginning to wane. The full moon would rise soon. The woods surrounding Blackthorn were older than memory, their towering oaks and twisted yews forming a labyrinth of shadow and silence. Villagers only ventured into the forest when necessity demanded it, gathering firewood, setting snares, or searching for lost livestock. Even during the day, the woods seemed alive with unseen eyes and rustling movements just beyond sight. On the evening of the full moon, a peculiar tension gripped the village. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and hearths stoked high as families huddled together. The disappearances of the past months had left a wound in Blackthorn, one that festered with fear and suspicion. Margaret Henshaw walked briskly from the clinic, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. The autumn air was crisp, tinged with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Though the clinic was unusually quiet that day, Dr. Grey had insisted she leave early, claiming he had paperwork to complete and would manage any late arrivals himself. As Margaret turned onto the main street, she glanced back toward the clinic. Its windows glowed faintly with lamplight, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow pass behind the curtains. She hesitated, then shook her head. Perhaps the doctor was simply moving about his work. Yet unease lingered. Margaret's path home took her past the churchyard and toward the edge of the woods. The moon, not yet risen, cast only a faint silver glow along the horizon. Her boots crunched against the gravel road, each step seeming louder than the last in the stillness. Halfway to her cottage, she heard it, a low, mournful howl that carried through the night like a knife sliding through silk. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Wolves, she thought. Though rare in these parts, tales of lone predators venturing from the northern wilderness were not unheard of. Still, something about the sound made her pulse quicken. It was deeper than any wolf's cry, filled with an uncanny resonance that prickled her skin. The howl rose again, joined this time by a strange rustling in the underbrush nearby. Margaret gripped the edges of her shawl and quickened her pace, her heart pounding. When she reached her cottage, she bolted the door behind her and leaned against it, her chest heaving. Outside, the night remained eerily quiet, save for the faint echo of that haunting sound. At the clinic, Dr. Grey stood alone in the dimly lit examination room. The last of his patients had left hours ago, and the building was silent save for the occasional creak of settling wood. He stared at the ledger on his desk, its pages filled with neat, precise entries recording the names of those he had treated. But tonight, his mind was not on his work. The moon was rising. He could feel it, a subtle pressure building in his chest, a heat spreading through his veins. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the desk. Not yet, he thought. He had taken precautions, as he always did. The basement of the clinic was secure, its iron door reinforced with heavy locks. No one would disturb him there. No one would see what he became. Dr. Grey reached into a drawer and retrieved a small vial of laudanum. He hesitated, staring at the amber liquid, before uncorking the bottle and swallowing its contents in a single bitter gulp. The opiate would dull his senses, perhaps buy him a few hours before the inevitable transformation took hold. But deep down he knew it was a futile measure. His affliction was no ordinary curse. It was ancient, bound to him by blood and moonlight, a shadow he could not escape. He had tried, oh how he had tried, but each month when the moon reached its zenith, the beast within him awakened, and no lock or chain could contain it. Dr. Grey closed his eyes, his breaths shallow and rapid. The first pangs of the change gripped him, a searing pain in his bones, his muscles tightening like cords drawn too taut. He stumbled toward the basement door, his vision blurring as the edges of his humanity began to fray. Meanwhile, in the village square, a group of men gathered under the dim light of the lanterns. Led by Constable Thomas Grayson, they murmured among themselves, their voices hushed but heavy with determination. "We cannot wait any longer," one of the men said, gripping a hunting rifle. "Another full moon, another missing soul. We must act." Constable Grayson nodded, his jaw tight. He had seen the remains of the butcher's mastiff, the unnatural wounds that no ordinary predator could have inflicted. The disappearances, the half-eaten livestock, the whispers of something monstrous stalking the woods, all signs pointed to a singular conclusion. "It'll be dangerous," Grayson said, his voice firm. "If it is what we think it is, we'll need silver. Aim true, and don't hesitate." The men nodded grimly. They carried torches, rifles, and silver-tipped ammunition, precautions born of legend but born out of necessity. As the first rays of moonlight broke through the clouds, the group set off toward the woods. Dr. Grey descended into the basement, his steps uneven as the first waves of transformation rippled through him. The air was damp and cold, the stone walls illuminated by a single flickering lantern. He bolted the iron door behind him and slid the heavy steel bar into place, his movements frantic yet practiced. The room was sparse, no furniture, no distractions, only a reinforced cage that dominated the center of the space. Its bars were thick, forged of tempered iron, and its door secured with a series of intricate locks. He had built it himself, a monument to his desperation. The pain grew sharper, searing through his body like molten iron. Dr. Grey doubled over, clutching his abdomen as his breathing grew ragged. His hands, once steady and precise, twisted before his eyes. The flesh stretched and warped, nails blackening and elongating into vicious claws. "No," he gasped, his voice thick and guttural. His vision darkened at the edges, a crimson haze creeping in. The beast was coming. He could feel it clawing its way to the surface, its hunger a gnawing abyss that could never be filled. Dr. Grey staggered to the cage, his legs trembling as his muscles contorted and reshaped. He threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. With shaking hands, he fumbled with the locks, securing them one by one as his mind teetered on the edge of oblivion. The laudanum had dulled the transformation, but only slightly. It was a flimsy barrier against the raw, primal force surging through him. His clothes tore as his body expanded, fur sprouting in coarse patches across his skin. His jaw elongated into a lupine snout, teeth sharpening into deadly points. A guttural growl escaped his throat, rising into a howl that echoed through the basement. The sound was primal, a harbinger of the monstrous thing he had become. The beast paced the cage, its glowing eyes scanning the room with feral intensity. It tested the bars, claws scraping against the iron with a screech that sent sparks flying. Each time the cage held firm, but the beast's frustration mounted. Somewhere in the recesses of its mind, a faint echo of Doctor. Grey's consciousness lingered. He could see through the beast's eyes, feel its hunger as though it were his own. It was a torment unlike any other, to be trapped in the depths of his own body, a helpless observer to the monster's relentless rage. The beast snarled, lunging at the bars with terrifying force. Saliva dripped from its fangs, pooling on the floor as it bared its teeth in frustration. But the cage, built to withstand such fury, remained unyielding. For now, Dr. Grey had no concept of time as the night stretched on. His memories of these episodes were always fragmented, a blur of rage and hunger, punctuated by moments of agonizing clarity. The beast's senses were heightened. He could smell the damp stone, hear the faint scurrying of rats in the corners, feel the pulse of life in every living thing nearby. And above it all, there was the hunger. The beast craved flesh, its instincts driving it to hunt, to kill. The cage denied it, but the need burned on, consuming every thought. From somewhere above, a faint sound reached the beast's ears. Voices. The monster stilled, its ears swiveling toward the noise. It sniffed the air, the scent of human sweat, and fear reaching it even through the heavy door. A low growl rumbled in its chest as it pressed against the bars, muscles coiled like a spring. In the back of its mind, Dr. Grey screamed. The voices grew louder as the villagers approached the clinic, their torches casting flickering shadows against its stone facade. The beast's instincts surged, the promise of prey igniting a frenzy. It slammed against the cage with renewed ferocity, its howls reverberating through the basement like thunder. Dr. Grey, trapped within his monstrous form, could only pray that the locks would hold. But deep down, he knew the truth. They wouldn't. The group of villagers, led by Constable Thomas Grayson, approached the clinic with torches held high and weapons at the ready. Their boots crunched on the gravel path, and their breaths formed pale clouds in the cool night air. Shadows danced across the clinic's stone walls, casting jagged shapes that seemed almost alive. "What if he's not there?" one of the men whispered, his grip tightening on his rifle. "He'll be here," Grayson replied, his voice low but resolute. "We've tracked the disappearances. They always lead back to him." The men nodded, their expressions grim. Each carried a weapon, from pitchforks to rifles tipped with silver bullets. Though their faces were etched with fear, there was determination in their eyes. Too many lives had been lost, and tonight they would demand answers. Grayson signaled for silence as they reached the clinic door. He raised his hand to knock but hesitated, listening. From within the building came a sound that chilled them all, a deep guttural growl, faint but unmistakable. "What in God's name was that?" one of the younger men muttered, his voice trembling. Grayson frowned. "Stay together. Be ready for anything." He knocked hard, the sound echoing in the still night. "Doctor! Grey!" Grayson called, his tone firm. "Open the door." There was no answer. The only response was the low growl, now joined by a rhythmic thudding sound, as though something heavy was striking metal. Grayson exchanged a wary glance with the others. "We're going in," he said. The door was unlocked. As it creaked open, the men raised their weapons, their torches casting light into the clinic's foyer. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang that made their stomachs churn. The growling grew louder, emanating from somewhere below. Grayson spotted a staircase at the back of the clinic, leading down into darkness. "Basement," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's where he is." The men hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to descend into the unknown. Grayson took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Stay behind me," he ordered, gripping his pistol tightly. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended, the growling growing louder with each step. The air grew colder, heavier, and the metallic scent became almost overwhelming. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves before a heavy iron door. The sounds from beyond the door were unmistakable now. Something large was moving inside, its growls punctuated by the screech of metal bending under strain. Grayson stepped closer, his torch casting light on the door. Deep scratches marred its surface, and the steel bar securing it quivered under each impact. "Dear God," one of the men breathed, his face pale. Grayson turned to them, his expression grave. "Whatever's in there, we have to stop it. Be ready." He reached for the steel bar, but before he could touch it, the door buckled with a deafening crash. The iron frame bent outward and a clawed hand shot through the gap, grasping wildly. The men stumbled back, shouting in terror as the beast slammed against the door again and again. With one final shattering blow, the door gave way. The creature burst into the room, its hulking form illuminated by the flickering torchlight. It was monstrous, towering and covered in coarse, matted fur. Its glowing eyes burned with feral rage, and its jaws, lined with razor-sharp teeth, dripped with saliva. For a moment, no one moved. The beast let out a roar that shook the very walls, then lunged. Grayson fired first, the crack of his pistol echoing like thunder. The silver bullet struck the beast's shoulder, and it recoiled with a snarl of pain. The other men followed suit, their weapons discharging in rapid succession. The room filled with smoke and chaos as torches flickered and bullets flew. The beast moved with terrifying speed, slashing and snapping at anything within reach. One man screamed as he was thrown against the wall, his torch clattering to the ground. Grayson fired again, this time striking the beast in its chest. The creature howled, its movements faltering as the silver burned through its flesh. But it wasn't enough. The beast charged, slamming into Grayson and sending him sprawling. His pistol skittered across the floor, just out of reach. "Now!" one of the men shouted. They rushed the creature with silver-tipped spears and knives, driving it back into the corner. It roared and thrashed, but the silver was too much. Finally, with a guttural growl, the beast collapsed. Its massive body hit the floor with a thud, and the room fell silent save for the men's ragged breaths. As they approached the fallen creature, its form began to shift. The fur receded, claws shrank, and the monstrous frame collapsed inward. Before their eyes, the beast transformed into something horrifyingly familiar. Dr. Elias Grey lay before them, his body twisted and broken. Blood stained his shirt, and his silver eyes, once so piercing, now stared blankly at the ceiling. Grayson knelt beside the body, his face pale. "It's true," he murmured. "He was the monster." The men stood in stunned silence, their torches flickering as the weight of their discovery settled over them. "What do we do now?" one of them asked. Grayson rose, his expression hardening. "We bury this thing, and we make sure no one ever forgets what happened here tonight." The dawn after the beast's death was cold and silent, the sunlight weak as it struggled to pierce the heavy mist that clung to Blackthorn. The men who had descended into the clinic's basement emerged shaken, their faces pale and haunted. Word of Dr. Elias Grey's monstrous secret spread quickly, and by midday a crowd had gathered in the village square. The doctor's body was wrapped in rough canvas and laid on a crude pyre erected at the edge of the woods. The villagers stood in uneasy silence, their expressions a mixture of fear, grief, and shame. For though the monster had been slain, they could not forget the man. "I don't understand," whispered Margaret Henshaw, her voice trembling as she clutched her shawl tightly. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her face streaked with tears. "He saved so many of us. He delivered my sister's child. He cared. He deceived us," Constable Grayson said, though his voice lacked conviction. He stood at the head of the crowd, a torch in his hand. "Whatever good he did was a mask. Beneath it, he was a killer." Margaret shook her head. "He fought it. You didn't see him like I did. He was kind. He didn't want this." Grayson hesitated, the torch flickering in his grasp. He turned to the crowd, his voice rising. "It doesn't matter what he wanted. What matters is what he did. The people he killed, the lives he took." The crowd murmured in agreement, but their voices were subdued. The pyre was lit. Flames crackled and roared, devouring the canvas and the body it contained. The villagers watched as the smoke rose into the gray morning sky, carrying with it the remnants of a man who had been both savior and monster. In the weeks that followed, Blackthorn tried to move on. The clinic was abandoned, its windows shattered, and its walls scorched by the fire of torches meant to cleanse it. Yet the villagers could not erase the memory of Dr. Grey. For Margaret, the grief was unbearable. She had admired him, respected him, and even in moments she could barely admit to herself, loved him. Now she wandered the village in a daze, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. Had he been cursed by some cruel twist of fate? Or had the beast always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moon to set it free? One night, unable to sleep, Margaret found herself drawn to the edge of the woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the full moon hung low in the sky, its light bathing the trees in a ghostly glow. She thought she heard a sound, soft at first, like a whisper on the wind. Then it came again, a low, mournful howl that sent a shiver down her spine. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. The howl rose, echoing through the woods like a lament. And in that moment, Margaret understood. The curse had not died with Dr. Grey. It lived on in the land, in the shadows, in the hearts of those who had loved and feared him. As the howl faded into the night, Margaret turned away, tears streaming down her face. She walked back to the village, her steps slow and heavy. Blackthorn would never be free of the beast. Its memory would haunt them, a shadow that stretched long and deep, its claws buried in their hearts. And on every full moon, when the wind carried the faintest echo of a howl through the village, the people would remember. The monster had been slain, but the tragedy would never die.